I think we academics sometimes do our research in a small ivory tower. We don't have a lot of chance to interact with the public. So this is really a wonderful opportunity that I appreciate very much. And thanks for the very generous introduction as well. And also thank, of course, all of you for coming. I'm just thinking, in my case, it's really wonderful to be coming to Madrid and talk about China and also the rest of East Asia in a global perspective. And East Asia is very far away in many cases. Of course, we all know that Spain has a lot of connection with China. In my case, my particular topic, I've been working on 19th century Chinese economy for a long time. And I want to talk about the general economic changes and then to link with the present period. And I'll be very happy to welcome any questions you will have afterward. Okay. I think I'm speaking, everyone can hear me okay, right? So, okay, so this sounds like a very modest title in many ways, but it's actually very tricky for Chinese economy. I often tell people I grew up, as the introduction, I grew up in Shanghai, China. I left China in 1989 when China was a relatively, it's hard to imagine, very poor economy. It still is a developing country, but today's China is becoming the world's second largest economy, is catching the world attention in many ways. So it's very interesting to have a long-term perspective. Why did China become what it has become today? And I remember in 1970s, 1980s, I myself, including leaders of China, can never imagine that all the economic changes that have happened in the last 20 years. And let me show you by figures. Okay, so one of the topic I have is about economic changes in China. Why did economic changes happen at all? I think we take it for granted now. China is the gross miracle and everything. But if you look at, in the early period, this is the part of the statistics. Oh, sorry. So this is GDP per capita. And, Chinese GDP per capita is very problematic. I'm not going to go into details on this. I've partly worked on this for quite a while, but many people would say from 1870 to 1950, so 1950 or not exactly 1949 is the Chinese communist regime established itself. So many people would say there's very little economic growth on aggregate level, okay? And then here comes the communist economy. Now you do have to see growth coming. However, there's very, very big fluctuations, big downturns. And this is the very well known, which I will talk a little bit later on, is probably what's called a Great Leap Famine under communism created during the Mao Zedong era. And I do not know how many of you know, 30 million people died of famine. So nearly half of the Spanish people population disappeared. And then the economy came back again. And then Mao died roughly 1976, 77. And this was followed by reform in the Deng Xiaoping era. And then died, a couple of decades ago. So this is where you see the Chinese economy is beginning to take off. Specifically, what's very important, it was actually really, even the initial reform period, it was not so obvious. It was really by early 1990s, the Chinese economy began to really take off. Anyway, the Chinese economy took off after I left. There's no connection, but it's remarkable when I was away how every time you went back to China, you realized the big changes not just happening in China, but also the perception of China when you were abroad. So this is really quite interesting, and this is the reason I'm giving this title. I'm using that, I think it was mentioned, I'm co-editing the Cambridge Economic History of China, where I'm supposed to write an introduction about the major themes. So this is partly what I'm trying to develop, why economic changes were happening, okay? To look at historical perspective, because this is the GDP data coming out of the Madison project that I and Leandra was involved. one of the big contrasts people would always say, this is Japanese per capita GDP, okay? Now, 1840, 1850, Japan and China were completely closed. And then by 1840-50, both countries were opened up by British imperialism. So this is a very, very important watershed period. One of the big story always, if you look at case of Japan, and today we think, which is where I'm based now, is one of the most developed economies in the world, which has all the high tech and so on. But that was not the case in the 1850s. It was very closed. People, they don't speak any foreign languages. The only thing they seem to know is they learned Dutch because Dutch were only allowed to trade. So when a country was opened up in Japan, they were, well, no offense to the Dutch people, they said, we learned the wrong language. We thought that was the only foreign language available. So this is how closed Japan was in many ways. But Japan became a star performer. We all know that story. Japanese per capita GDP was rising all the time, and it was overtaking China. And I'll get back to the historical perspective of this, because that's quite important. For a long time, before Japan developed, China never really looked at Japan as anything important, because it was an isolated country. Most of the things in Japan was copied from China in terms of the language, culture, ideology, Confucianism, and all of the things. Of course, there's something they developed independently. So when Japan modernized, that became a very big shock. So in many ways, you always think about this particular period with the Chinese stagnation, which I showed you earlier, okay? And this is something I want to set it up a little bit, explaining how Chinese economic changes were happening. Now, I want to emphasize, I think this is a little bit exaggeration. I don't think the early Japanese GDP per capita was much higher than China in the early period. The other data which we've done is looking at real wages. That you could see the Japanese real wages only began to overtake China at the turn of the 20th century, and which is something very important. Not many people know. Japan started out as a cheap, low-wage country. They actually claim they were cheaper, their wages were cheaper than in India. That's why Japan was having cotton textile industry. But of course, by 20th century, things began to turn around. By 1930s, Japanese per capita income was 3 times that of China. Now, the real wage data we have talked about is we want to emphasize Chinese per capita income. Industrial Revolution. So in many ways, China was already falling behind in the 18th century. It was only a third of the England. And we will get back to these questions a little bit later on. What was Chinese economy before China was opened up? This is another set of GDP per capita estimates, which go back a little bit earlier to 1840. So you can basically see there's not much of economic growth in China before all the things that were happening, okay? So I can certainly offer you a lot more data on this. One of the things that's quite interesting is this is not very good to see. The Chinese economy represented a very typical traditional backward agrarian economy. Agriculture took about 60% of the value added, and that was very, very clear. And that lasted all the way until into the 1950s. So I think any claim that Chinese economy was advanced was very, very tricky. There are some small changes, which is something we'll talk about later on, but the changes are very minor on national level. Bear in mind, in the 20th century, in the 1920s and 30s, China had the world's largest population. It had about 400 million people, and actually, 1930s had 500 million people, and now, of course, it's even larger and so on. So whatever it is, this is a huge economy in that perspective, but relatively backward in per capita terms. Anything happens in China is going to be on a very, very large scale. So here's my questions I'm asking today, and here's what I'm doing for the book chapter as well for today's lecture, is why did change occur at all? Because for a long time, the Chinese economy just basically stay at a level. And we mentioned Angus Madison and all the newspaper article talking about Chinese economy in the 18th century under Qing dynasty was the world's leading economy. And I've been telling many, many people that was a complete illusion. that China was the world's largest economy because it had 300, 400 million people, but the per capita income was very low. But because per capita income difference was not very big, so it becomes the world's largest economy. So the idea today's Chinese economy is growing to recover the historical level, that was actually wrong, because in Qing economy, China had very little influence outside the world. Unlike today, you can see the investment, I think there's talk about one belt, one road, and all kinds of things that were happening. So this is something very, very important. The economic growth, the real impact only happened much more later. And when it happened, why did it happen? So I want to really emphasize economic change did not happen automatically. And it had to happen in China because certain things come together. And this is not just something, country open up and everything just grow, human capital that was there. One thing in earlier research, I showed China always had a relatively large human capital reserve. The literacy rates of Chinese people in a poor economy were relatively high, but you do not see economic takeoff. Okay, so, and how did it take off? And this is very, very interesting because 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and when I was, I did my dissertation in North Carolina, Chapel Hill, I was comparing China and Japan. The major question I asked, why was Chinese economy such a failure compared with Japan? But now it's very interesting after the 1990s growth, and people asking slightly different question. Why did it take so long for Chinese economy to suddenly, grow like this? And if it's growing like this, what does it mean? Will this continue? So I think, I hope by the end of this talk that you will see a historical perspective is really quite important, and I do think it's maybe sometimes missing from contemporary economists studying China, including many contemporary economists studying Chinese economy inside China. Okay, here's the question I'm posing. And let me go back to the prehistory or pre-modern history a little bit to give you an idea what I call the traditional Chinese equilibrium. And one thing I'm going to try to do, I know this is not easy, that I'm talking about this in Spain. I'll be talking a lot about Chinese geography, different kind of historical personalities, and so on. So I try to make it as simple, as clear as possible. One thing, this is a current Chinese map. The parts in blue is what's called agricultural China. So the thing about labor-intensive agriculture usually happened here. And this is all what's called nomadic regions. This is Tibet, which is a Han Plateau. So there is very different lifestyles between these two different parts of China. And this, now you begin to understand, the Great Wall was built. The Great Wall was built as a defense by the agrarian parts of China against the nomadic invasions. Okay, as you all know, the Great Wall was a very, very important landmark in Chinese history. And now, what I'm going to talk about today is, in particular, 4 regions or 3 regions of China that will have a very important role to play in our understanding of why economic changes are taking place or why they are not taking place. First, of course, we know this is the capital, Beijing, right? This is the center of the political center. It only become a center from the 14th century. The earlier center was somewhere here. Some of you may have been to Xi'an, but that was a little bit later. Now, for a long time, the Chinese threat to the Chinese empire was always coming from here. And this is very, very important. China faced very little threat from here because this is the Himalaya, okay? So it was completely covered. Very little threat from here because this is the coastal area. Except once in a while, there's something, the Portuguese, the Spaniards, they have set up Macau and Manila that was coming from the southeast. But overall, the Chinese, the major threat is coming from the northern territory of China. The last dynasty that ruled China is from Manchuria. Okay, they went into Beijing, they took all of China. And then they unified the whole nomadic agrarian areas of China. So this is something very important. So what I try to talk about is by mid-19th century, and even though the Westerners have been coming from the coastal area for a long time, but when the British came, the Opium War came, this is becoming a real major issue. The first time the British were attacking Canton, and in order to show off to the Chinese emperor, we can not only attack Canton, we can also move along the coastline and go all the way to Beijing. That's what they exactly did. They attacked the Tianjin, which is the port of Beijing. And they forced open China to what's called free trade. Okay, so this is something that's becoming very important. Now, for a long time, China restricted trade to only the city of Canton. Today, it's called Guangzhou. As you know, after Opium War, Hong Kong became part of the British colony. So this is where this is all coming from. One thing that's very interesting, the Chinese economic center was in this area, in the Yangtze River. Okay, but they were not allowed to trade with the West directly. So with the Opium War, the opening of the treaty ports, suddenly China you can trade along these different treaty ports. Now, the trading center was moving into that area, which we will see is the city of Shanghai. That's where I grew up. So this is something I will talk about. The economic center, trading center was shifting to this area. And then we will talk about what was happening in the middle Yangtze. Okay, the political leaders, certainly, especially Mao Zedong, came from the middle Yangtze. This is what's called the Agrarian center of China. These are the coastal area of China. Okay, I want to lay that out because there's a lot of things I'll be writing on this. This is something I did a little bit yesterday, is the Chinese Empire was disintegrating into different kind of states for a long time. So this is 750 BC, and eventually by 1900, 1800, Chinese Empire was becoming one. And this is something, we're talking about a huge difference between Europe and China. The Roman Empire was there, the Han Empire was there, but the Chinese Empire collapsed and regrouped and become a single empire. So by the time the British came in the mid-19th century, China was a one single empire, which had a very consistent ruling ideology. It developed something what I call some kind of traditional equilibrium. So I want to describe that equilibrium quickly, and then I move on to show how the Western impact is having on the Chinese economy, and to certainly has changed completely the direction of the Chinese trajectory. So what is this particular system? One thing so sometimes you can call the pillar of the empire. You have the emperor sitting on the top, then you have bureaucrats and gentry, which is very different from the English meaning. And most importantly, China was the country that had a civil service examination. Sometimes in Chinese it's called Keju, and it's a remarkable examination with 3 levels that people take them. The exam is open to 95% of the male population, and once you took the exam, you gain social status, you can become a bureaucrat. And that bureaucrat is loyal to the Chinese emperor. And China was ruled by a bureaucratic system. It's not ruled by a feudal system. Okay, this is something that's very, very critical, very important. The whole thing was hierarchical. All the important posts were appointed. Okay, so they can appoint governors, they can appoint county magistrates. So in China, I was sometimes kind of joking that China had something close to a modern state, much earlier than many other states. If you, you probably have heard of Francis Fukuyama, who wrote The Origin of Political Order. I think he was exaggerating, but he wanted to show China. And this system, by the way, has survived for 2,000 years. China set up this particular system from 200 BC. Okay, I mean, of course, it had the changes and so on, but they were arguing that China, the first civil service examinations, first impersonal bureaucracy system. Okay, so it's a very and this is part of reason China becoming very unified over time, because it was ruled relatively internally in a very cohesive manner. There's no feudal decentralization. Okay, so this is the political economy of the Chinese system, and that's very important. Once China established system, this is Confucius ideology. Confucius ideology was very interesting. They don't like heavy taxation. They actually want small government. They say if you tax people heavily, that means the government was not very good. And once you unify the empire, you restore peace and order, you reduce warfare, you use suppression, all kinds of things, per capita tax revenue began to decline. This is from Song dynasty, which is the most prosperous dynasty in Chinese history. This is index 100. You can see by Qing dynasty, which had a population of 300 or 400 million people, on average, Qing, this is the This is the remarkable figure we have. This is the number of days a Chinese peasant need to work to pay off his taxes. It's only about 1 or 2 days. It's a very, very low taxes. And compare that with England. England, you have to work about 17 days to pay off your tax revenue. So you can see that's very interesting. When the Opium War happened, I mean, England was selling the Navy all the way around the world to launch the attack. And that's because England had that particular fiscal capacity to mount that attack. So this is something that's very important equilibrium that China established what's called provisioning state, a state to provide basic public goods, making sure there's no disturbance, no famine, if possible, and then people live, and actually small government, despite the formal bureaucracy. We can talk about that later on. China remained a very, very small government. Now, I'm not saying that's a good government. It's highly repressive in terms of ideology. Okay, that's something and also because it's a single state, there's no constraint on the power of the emperor in any way. And what is even worse, in Europe, if you live in a bad state, you try to go to another state. In China, there's no such option. So everybody really pray that this is a good emperor, because otherwise you can't run anywhere at all. Okay, so this is a little bit of a summary of this. I won't have time to go into the details of this. Imagine you are a Chinese emperor, and you are in this traditional Confucius ideology. You want to know very little about what was happening in the outside world, okay? And then suddenly you encountered British who had these modern weapons, and you find a way to interpret them. This is what something about challenges, right? Remember all the challenges China had coming from the nomads, the Mongols, the Manchus, you heard of Genghis Khan. So suddenly, for 2,000 year history, some powerful forces coming from the south. And then they didn't know who these people were because they had no world map. They don't speak any foreign languages. They actually banned people from traveling abroad. They had to trade and so on. So this is something, a shock. In the beginning, they thought, oh, these were like Mongols. We can just buy them off. And also, look, the Europeans have so many states. They're fighting against each other. The Europe must be very backward because in China's warring states period, we had many states, but we are smart enough to make it into one state. So all these things they try to understand. This is what I try to talk about, the perceptions and reality, how to interpret the Western challenge. That's very, very important because every time, as I will show you, for the next 150 years, the West kept surprising them because that's something important. Unlike the Mongols, the West actually developed an entire system of ideology, of governance, and a legal system. And the Mongols were, in that sense, do not have that particular ideology. They began to adopt the Chinese institution. Okay, so what did the West do? How was the Western impact being felt in China? One thing that's very important, China was never colonized fully. Unlike India, unlike many other countries, China did not become a full colony. But what the West did is they set up what's called treaty ports. So on these treaty ports, the Westerners can import goods free of tariff. The Westerners could live there in those areas, and they will be tried by Western law only. That's very important. They are not subject to Chinese law. Now, there are many, many treaty ports open in different waves. First, there's 5 treaty ports, but what I would tell you, the most important treaty port is the treaty port of Shanghai, okay? And Hong Kong was actually Hong Kong was a colony, it was not a treaty port. So we will show this is how eventually the West impact was being felt, because the Westerners, they did not take over China, but they based their forces inside China, and was followed by Christian missionaries and all these things and so on. Okay, so this is a summary of Western impact, and we see how the Chinese really slowly try to come to understand what the West is. And this is not just by watching, but this is also by studying. Okay, and they're not just by studying by themselves. They eventually began to study from Japan, who studied the West first. So this is what I try to emphasize, how the ideology becomes very, very important, that you cannot just by looking at institutions and copy them. Okay, so I don't think I want to go through this in great detail. I'll go about these examples. But one thing I want to show is ideology played a very big role in China's response to the West. Okay, so this is a very good summary. This man is called Liang Qizhao. He was a reformer, tried to defend the empire, and something I will talk about later, he was the one who took the civil service examination, earned the highest degree. So in China, if you earn the highest degree, you will be received by the emperor, and you will be guaranteed a life of privilege. Now, he happened to take the last couple exams before it was abolished, so he was very distinguished, and then he himself became a professor. He studied the West. So he became really someone who turned to look at the Western clothes he was wearing and so on. So he had a very good summary of the Chinese understanding of the West. When China first encountered the West, when they were defeated in the Opium War, the first thing they realized is the West had better guns. This is the kind of weapon they had never seen before. So in order for China to catch up, we need to develop our military technology. Okay? That was the first phase of Chinese response. And then, which I will show you later on, when they developed military technology, they built their modern army, and then they fought the war. They were still losing war to the West, but then they fought the war with Japan, who was also learning military technology, but who actually adopted a Western constitution and who adopted a Western legal system. And that they fought a modern Navy war in 1894. And when China lost, this is when China realized what was making West very strong is not just the guns. What was behind them is the institution. It was what's called constitution. So this began the second phase of reform. And he said it was now beginning to get into the system. Okay, and then of course they were massively copying the West, who had massively copying Japan. Because Japan culturally was very close. They went through, it's like your classmates. You learn from your classmates much better than someone you don't know, right? And then they began to set up the parliament and everything, and the Chinese constitution parliament completely collapsed, unlike it was successful in Japan or in England. So this is when it's very interesting. The third phase of Chinese response is, wait a minute, it's not just institution. When you set up a constitution, you set up a parliament, you need sounds all very familiar. You need a culture. So China needs to exchange its culture. And this is when China saw the most radical extreme reform is they began to completely change Chinese culture, including abolishing the civil service examination, abolishing Confucius ideology, including, for example, this guy, he's dressed in Western clothes now. So that's also something very important, the social change that's happening. Okay, so I will go through this process, but what does it mean for the economic change? Okay, so if you use that framework, you can see the first phase is 1850, 1890. China was only doing military technology. They only imported military technology. Confucianism was perfect. The Chinese ideas the Chinese spirit was very good. Okay, and the second phase, when defeated by Japan, they said, we need to change the system. The Chinese spirit is still okay. And then when 1911, when the empire fell, when the constitution fell, this is when they began to change culture. And that's the most radical. That actually led to the rise of communism. If you imagine, communism is the most extreme form of, to some cultural change. It's ironic today, communism became another conservative movement. That's another thing in China, but we see it in the origin of this is quite interesting. Okay. Now, in the process, remember the different regions I was telling you about? So in the process of this, I will go through how the Chinese intellectuals from different areas beginning to respond to this challenge and how they use these ideas to influence the government and to make the Chinese government to adopt policies in each of different phases. So the first you will see, that the one I show you in the middle Yangtze, the agrarian part, they were the ones most prominent in the first phase of change, military technology. And the second group is the Guangdong, the people who were exposed to the West. And the third group is the Shanghai elites, the lower Yangtze. And they were the ones that began to implement putting China into a modern state. So and they each used Confucius or traditional Chinese ideology. They changed them, and that's something very important. They were saying, these actually are consistent with what we can do. Because they have to justify. You can't just change something without coming up with a systematic theory that explaining why you do this, why you do that. Okay, so let me start with many of you may have heard of Taiping Rebellion. This happened in 1850, 1860, when Chinese empire was weakened. So this is the leader of the rebel. And one thing that was very important about him, he tried to take the civil service examination. He failed. And then he fell ill, and then he began to wake up. He thinks he's the brother of Jesus. He launched this entire rebellious movement, and that lasted 10 years and set up a traditional empire in the middle Yangtze, along the Yangtze River. The entire Taiping Rebellion destroyed the richest part of China, have killed about probably 70 million people in the period of 10 years. And this is very important because this marked the beginning of disintegration of Chinese empire. Remember, Chinese empire was very cohesive and so on. So the Qing Empire in Beijing was completely unable to suppress them. What did it do? Who are the people that came? That's very interesting. These are people coming from Hunan province. All three of them passed highest level civil service examination. So they are the most prestigious members of the society. They raised the money, they raised the army themselves from their local provinces. And they suppressed, using modern weapons, the Taiping rebellions. And these are what I call the Middle Yangtze Hunan. They are all from people of Hunan origin, which is a province in China. Hunan also produces spicy food. You might have heard of Sichuan food, so Hunan food is very much. So also the Hunan people are known being very tough people. They eat spicy food. They are also very, very strong politicians. They are the ones who wanted to save China. So they are the ones that really restored China after they suppressed the Taiping Rebellion. They handed the power back to the Qing. They dissolved the army. They defended the empire. And then they were given important posts and to begin to develop military technology. Okay, all was going well. I'm going through this in a very, very rough fashion until one of the Navy, led by these people, confronted Japan over the issue of Korea, the control of Korea. And the Chinese Navy lost very, very badly in 1894. That was quite a shock because the Chinese Navy was much larger. They had much better ships, but they were defeated by Japan, who went through similar kinds of reforms, but the country was much smaller. Now, you can already notice when they signed this treaty, this is a humiliating treaty, all the Japanese were dressed in Western clothes. So Japan had seen a very, very extreme Westernization, okay, where China actually did not accept military technology, did not want to change anything else. So that was something of a shock, that China needed to change something much more fundamental. And that's when Japan became a model for China. And this is where it's very interesting to begin to adopt constitutional reform under the Qing. They abolished the exam, and that's really, really quite something. They took Japanese legal experts, drafted a Japanese constitution. Japanese constitution was based on the German model and based partly on the French model, but they adapted to their own. And they began to import massively Japanese teachers. And also Chinese students began to study in Japan. So and at that time, studying abroad is very expensive. Japan was much cheaper, so in all kinds of ways. So this is really the second phase reform. And the people who champion the reform are people from Guangdong province. And one of them, this is Liang Qichao again. And they are really, really quite interesting. They wanted to have a completely open constitutional reform like Japan, but they want to protect the last emperor. The dynasty is fine. We do not want to have a republic. Okay? So this is their dream. But whatever it is, that era actually began to have real changes, which I will show you. The economic changes are really happening in that time because first time China began to allow private enterprise. Okay, so then we know the empire in 1911 collapsed. Okay, this is where all things are happening in a very interesting way because China no longer had a central government. So this is the part of the story I want to say a little bit is where real economic change are taking place when China as empire was disintegrating. Now it's hard for many, for politicians to take. Well, what happened is the Westerners, as the British went to Shanghai, this is a map of Shanghai. This is the Huangpu River, which I will show you photos later on. So this is the international settlement run mostly by American and by British. This is the French concession. Shanghai was the largest treaty port. This particular area became the most important place for Chinese industry, Chinese banks, and also other things, Chinese universities and so on. This is old Shanghai. Before Shanghai was like this, the Westerners came that really completely transformed. So let me show you how this particular transformation began to connect with the Chinese elites there. So you can see now everything was started by the West. Foreign firms came in. Then the number of Chinese firms was really rising, okay? So this is what I try to emphasize. A lot of people talk about China as being a colony, but if you really think who are the ones really benefiting from the Western presence is actually Chinese firms when they even do not have, and they did not take place here. Right after Opium War, nothing happened. It was military technology, all government factories, no private entrepreneurs. Okay, but after the signing of the treaty, then they began to really take off. They not only took off, they actually beat the foreigners in China. So this is something I try to comfort my Chinese audience that, you should never be afraid of the West because there's enough entrepreneurship in China. They were really, really strong that even with all the bad conditions. So let me show you where the data is becoming interesting. This is where everything is beginning now breaking out. This is the modern cotton textile industry in China. Only started 1890. This is what I mean that you cannot take for granted change always happened. No, it took 30 years for change to happen. Modern textile industry, then the Great Depression. We all know that. That's international conditions and so on. Modern industry was growing at about 8 to 10%, from 1912 to 1930s, 36, when Chinese empire was no longer cohesive empire. Rather you have foreigners, you have all kinds of people that are taking over, the empire was very, very weak. So this is part of my efforts trying to rewrite Chinese history a little bit. I think a lot of people inside China tend to associate that political weakness with economic weakness, and I try to show that's not necessarily true. Sometimes political strength does not translate into trade. The same things happening. China was opened up. You don't see much trade happening. Rather, it was around the time when China was defeated by Japan. Suddenly, trade began to take off as well. This is the most interesting, important part. If you look at Chinese banks, China had no modern banks, there are no corporations and so on. But Chinese banks began to take off after 1910s. But not only that, the Chinese banks, such as Bank of China, became the largest bank. We all know, you probably know HSBC, which was founded in Hong Kong, but the most important operation was in Shanghai. But Bank of China Shanghai actually rivaled HSBC. So this is how, and this is completely private Chinese entrepreneur. Bank of China today became a government bank. After 1950s. That's another story. Okay, so let me show you how important in this case the presence of the treaty port played. This is the location of banks. If you think about Shanghai took more than half of all the banks, Chinese banks, not to mention foreign banks. Foreign banks, of course, they're located in treaty ports in Shanghai, but even the Chinese banks, they're located in the treaty port because the treaty port had a Western legal system to a certain degree and whatever, all kinds of protection that was there. And the other element that was beginning to develop that was very, very interesting, in the interest of time, I don't want to go on. China, at a time when empire government became very, very weak, developed its first tax revenue collecting agency and developed the first public debt market and the bond market. Traditional China never had a public debt. This is, comparing with Europe, it's really, really very striking. European public debt went back, as long as the Roman times. But traditional China never had a public debt. But in this time, China developed a second market for public debt, all partly because the agency was run by this Irish person, which made the agency quite independent. So he was wearing two clothes. This is a Chinese robe. He's ranked number 3 in the Chinese bureaucracy. that is very, very high. I mean, the emperor is ranked number 1. You have 9 ranks and so on. So this guy has done very well. And he was also knighted in England as well. But he ran the central. And what was the revenue for? The revenue was used as a collateral for public debt. Okay, so this is something, an element at which, this is the Chinese public debt market, and that's really quite remarkable for the early 20th century. When the government was disintegrating and all of that, you have actually a very viable public debt market that have come about. And this is the public debt market, the secondary market. So you can sell these bonds very freely in the market in Shanghai. So you can see that the financial sector was really booming. And these public debt were used to provide collateral for money supply. So you can see very interesting Chinese money supply increased, mostly in the form of paper notes issued by private banks. You know, this is all these HSBC, Bank of China. I mean, there's talk about this hierarchy free banking model that worked in China in the 1920s and 30s very well. And if you ever visit Hong Kong today, you will notice Hong Kong paper money was issued by 3 private banks. That was a legacy of that era. So this is really coming from the legacy of the free banking era. So it was completely run by the entrepreneurs, having something to do with government, but not a lot. Okay. I want to say that background is because this, remember the third group, the Lower Yangtze, the area near Shanghai. This is when the Nanjing government began to set up a capital in Nanjing, which is close to Shanghai. Now, you can see this is the third group. That's quite interesting. They were dressed in completely modern clothes. This is Sun Zhongshan, and this is Jiang Jieshi, who grew up in Ningbo, and who studied in Japan, in the Japanese military academy. And Sun Zhongshan spent a long time in Japan, so you can see the Japanese influence really come in. And then things began to turn around by 1920s and 30s. Jiang Jieshi, who was a traditional person coming from a village, married this woman by the name of Song Meiling. And this is the Song sisters. So this is really the royal family of China that based in Shanghai. They grew up in Guangdong. They're all Christians. They had education at Wesley College in the US. And they, of course, completely fluent in English. Jiang Jieshi was not. And this really marked a time for new change in many ways, that you suddenly have a new group of elites that rose, that began to take power, and setting up the Nanjing government and all of that. We all know what happened. The Japanese government, the Japanese full-scale invasion happened in 1937, which is a huge disaster in many ways. But one of the big disasters, the Japanese did not succeed in conquering China. But what happened, it gave breathing space to the communists, which were in a very bad trouble, because Jiang Jieshi, who had an alliance with the communists, broke with them and was chasing them. Some of you may have heard a Long March, right? So the communists was running through the Long March. When the Japanese invasion happened, China was broken apart. And eventually we all know what was happening. The Soviets and all these things were coming in. So you could see that. Now, there's a lot of debates about this. Nanjing government existed for 10 years, and they were saying that for 1927 to 1937. So they were maybe the first modern government that built modern industry. And I try to argue the Nanjing government was able to have achievements because of all the things happened in Shanghai before they established a central government. The entrepreneurs really laid a very foundation for the modern Chinese economy, even in the 1920s. And actually, what's called the Shanghai capitalists, did not like Jiang Jieshi at all. Jiang Jieshi was a military person, they do not get along. But the Shanghai capitalists all living in the international settlement. So very bizarrely, the Chinese were protected by Western legal system. In the international settlement, 90% of the residents were Chinese. They were supposed to be for foreigners, but the Chinese were living there, and they paid the largest amount of taxes. That's another part of the story. So this is becoming something that was very, very important. So let me probably, by way of sort of taking it to the modern period, as more of a linking the past with the present, and in the interest of time, I will obviously go through this relatively quickly. Is we all know when the Japanese invaders were defeated. The idea the Nanjing government, Zhang would take over. But what happened is actually the communists defeated the nationalist government of Zhang in the civil war and eventually took over all of China. And the person who was the leader of the communist government is Mao Zedong. Now, this is quite interesting. I mean, this is why people in China will feel offended a little bit. Mao Zedong came from the province of Hunan. Remember, that's the first generation of people that restored China to peace or order. Now, it's very ironic because Mao Zedong was the leader of a communist movement, right? We all know communism is coming from Marxism. You know, it's the most advanced Western ideology. But Mao Zedong, one thing that was very important, he has never been abroad, except twice to Soviet Union after he became the leader. Okay, and we all know Mao Zedong spent most of his time reading Chinese classics. He writes Chinese poems. So it's very interesting to think about what this particular, and that's why history becomes very interesting. Mao talked much more about Chinese emperors than about Marxist ideology. Actually, Mao was uncomfortable with Marxist ideology because in Mao's government there are many of these intellectuals coming from Soviet Union, and Mao, found it was very difficult to deal with them because they have these terminologies he couldn't deal with very well. So this is, of course, in many ways you can think about traditional ideology and was coming in a different form. We all know a little bit about what happened in the Mao because there's a massive industrialization movement, the Soviet style, the revolution, right? Mao had a very simple solutions for everything. For example, Christian missionaries in Shanghai just kicked them out. And people who are on drugs, would put you in jail. And that really actually cleaned the country, cleaned the city of Shanghai up and so on. But in the process of this, I don't think I want to go through that. There's a huge amount of damage done to the economy. There was most famous Great Leap Famine, right, which led to the deaths of 30 million people. And cultural revolution, massive persecution of intellectuals and other political leaders. One of the leaders, as you will see, that was persecuted many, many times was Deng Xiaoping. But the remarkable thing about Deng Xiaoping was that he survived. And he survived after Mao died. Okay, I'll go through this relatively quickly, and this is Mao declaring China has stood up on 1949. The big question is Mao really a Marxist, or is he really a traditional Chinese emperor? So this is something that, it's probably a combination of both, because China was much more. So I told you that when Mao died in 1976, Deng Xiaoping was not the successor. It was someone else. But it was a political coup. Deng Xiaoping came back to power. Deng Xiaoping was a communist. But for very, very, reasons we still don't understand, Deng Xiaoping was single-mindedly pushing for reform. It was unclear where he was going. Now, Deng Xiaoping was a very different personality. He was much shorter. He was very modest. He was from the province of Sichuan and so on. So, I'm going to go through this. I want to just bring out the implications of this. In the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping did not have a very clear idea where China was going. That's why ideology was very important, because Deng Xiaoping did not want to change communism. Deng Xiaoping, even though he suffered under Mao, but he didn't want to say Mao was a leader, like, you should take him out and everything. So all these gradual reform happened. Then we all know what happened in 1989, Tiananmen Square. And then Deng Xiaoping fired his own successor, right? And this is a man who is already in his 80s, late 80s and 90s, and he was in his last years. And then nobody dared to reform anymore. And this is, of course, something very unusual. By 1992, Deng Xiaoping had a Parkinson's disease. He was mumbling. The only person who understood him is his daughter. So he went to the south, and he was beginning to say, through his daughter, anybody should reform. If leaders do not reform, he should be fired. Deng Xiaoping had no official power anymore. This is one old man that was very, very important. And I think, there was all these very interesting conversations because people get so scared after Tiananmen Square, right? So somebody was saying, well, if we try to do this, that's capitalism. That's not socialism. And when Deng Xiaoping was told that, he would ask them, is that productive? Is it this was productive? He said, yes, it was very productive, but it was capitalism. Then Xiaoping said, okay, let's just call it socialism. Let's go ahead and do it. This is the whole ideology of Deng Xiaoping in many ways. He did not change the fundamental political institutions. He opened it up a little bit, but then he pushed for market reform. And this is where Chinese economy really took off from 1992. And in particular, there's someone by the name of Zhu Rongji who became the premier. And he is also, by the way, from Hunan province. And he became the strongest reformer. And he's, so in this case, I think this is when the Chinese economy really, really began to take off. So let me probably, in many ways, bringing kind of to close, maybe open, making sure I give time for questions and so on, that to look at what was the emphasis I'm trying to do here. So I have a thing comparing the before and then after, that I try to show when you think about Chinese economic changes, you cannot think about in economic terms only. The way how the empire was constructed, the way how the policies should be explained played a very, very big role. And each generation leaders and intellectuals struggled to come up with explanation and to put them into practice. And to see how that works. This is something that is very, very important. And China was such a large country. There are different forces that was driving them. You can see the regional elites that were very, very important. So ideology had an independent role to play here. And in that respect, history was also something very, very important. And I will talk a little bit about the ideology is coming today. So now we have two generations of leaders after Deng Xiaoping, and that's really quite remarkable. With Jiang Zemin, with Hu Jintao, China has seen remarkable growth. And then we have Xi Jinping, which we can talk about a little later. One other thing very puzzle is there are signs that there is a going back to building a party state, a Leninist type of party state. It's a lot of people almost forgot, right? But then you have to really understand the ideology to see why this is going that direction. We still do not know very, very clearly where it's going. So let me end, probably, we can talk about questions, with some advertisement promotion from our hometown city. No, that was a joke. But I want to end some photos, which I find remarkable. This is the city of Shanghai. So this is a map of Shanghai I showed you, right? Before Shanghai was opened up, this is what the city was like, okay? So that's what this round city was. And this is what it would, this is a fake city, but this is what traditional Shanghai was, okay? And then you can see by the 1920s, this is all rising. This is the river, this is the famous Bund, this is the banking district of China along the waterfront. So this is Shanghai. You can see this is the custom house. This is Bank of China. These are Western style buildings. This is really the banking district of China in the 1930s and 1920s. It's really, really quite remarkable. And then I want to show you this. So this is still Shanghai in the 1980s. In the 1990s, Deng Xiaoping came here. He looked at these buildings. He said, why the colonists can build a banking center like this? We Chinese today cannot build another one. So he looked over across the river. This is the Pudong. He said, we should build another new financial center. 10 years later, this is Pudong Financial District in Shanghai today. I mean, this is a photo they're taking in 1910. Today, it was really like a mini version of Dubai. So in some sense, I think in many ways thinking about how the changes happen through time, how history, ideology play a very big role. Thank you very much. I've taken quite a bit of time.
Any questions in Spanish?